Chapter 11. People think of the past as being black and white, as if nostalgia were painted only in sepia. That's not my experience. I may have stopped seeing the world in full color when I was changed, but before that, when I was only an angry young man, I saw every shade of ardent green and every hue of bloody red. No amount of blood I ever saw matched the angry crimson that filled my world when I saw my father staring at my baby sister, his own daughter, his eyes gleaming with filthy desire. His arm moved in a disgusting rhythm beneath his jacket as he leered at her. It had been 5 years since he'd broken my arm. The first and only time I'd ever struck him, but the arm still ached. I hadn't forgotten my lesson. I still dreamed about it, and I'd never raised a hand to him again. I'd taken every beating without fighting back. I'd lost every match he'd forced me into. Every time I'd gotten back on my feet. I'd tried to show defiance in my eyes, and I'd come back for more. But I never hit him back. Not until that day. I'd finished a shift at the cannery. It was summer work, but it was more than my father seemed able to hold down. I reeked of fish oil and the salty smell of salmon, and I'd hurried home precisely because I knew that my father wasn't working, and I didn't like leaving Maggie when he might be coming home. Most of the time he'd occupy himself with some debauchery or other in town and wouldn't return until long after I did. But his money must have run out that day. I liked to take the alleyways when I walked home. Just an old habit that came with preferring my own company. I don't think he knew that about me, or even what time I came home in the evening. If he'd ever cared about me at all beyond the thought of what he could use me for, he'd have known better than to think that there'd be nobody to see him in the backyard that day. Or maybe he really believed that I was a pathetic, broken thing and was too drunk to care if I saw him or not. His back was to me when I hopped the fence into our meager yard. At first, I thought he was taking a piss against the corner of the house. Then I saw through the window the washroom where my sister was taking her bath. I couldn't see her. I could only see her clothes hanging behind the closed door, and the traces of steam on the window, and I could hear her singing to herself, as she always did in the bath. I saw the reflection of his face then, staring down at her in the tub from behind, smirking and twitching as he worked at himself. Then, in the reflection, he saw me. His gray eyes went wide in shock, but then he recognized who had caught him. He tucked himself away in his breeches and spun on me. "You got some nerve," he said. "Me? I was in the wrong?" I stared at him in disbelief. I didn't move. "Go on," he said. "Get, before I bust your ugly face." I didn't move. My knuckles were white with pressure as I clenched my fists and stared at this man who had tormented us for my entire life. I remembered all the times I'd held Maggie under the bed and wished I'd been brave enough or big enough to help our poor mother. "Boy, you're asking for it," he said. Suddenly, he didn't look as big as I'd always thought he was. I realized for the first time that I was looking him in the eye instead of looking up at him. He pulled his belt out and gripped it in his right hand, the way he always did before he'd whip me with it. Crack! He snapped it at me. It struck my upper left arm and slashed down across my chest. I knew it would leave a welt. It might even be bleeding. But I didn't feel it. What I felt were Maggie's eyes on us as she pressed her face against the glass. She must have been startled by the sound of our father's voice and had come to see what was happening. I looked at her face, and I remembered the split he had left in her lip the day he had broken my arm, the day he had hit my sister. Crack! The leather slapped against me again, but this time I reached out with my right hand and snatched it, tearing it away from him and throwing it on the uncut grass between us. His eyes widened in outrage, pure shock that I would disobey him, that I would resist him. He swung at me, a right hook as slow and as telegraphed as I'd ever seen. If I'd been in the ring, I'd have thought it was a fake-out. Nobody could be so pathetically clumsy. It would be the easiest thing in the world to move out of the way or even to duck it entirely. Had he always been this slow? Or was I just faster? It didn't matter. I let him have the hit. I knew he couldn't hurt me anymore. His fist cracked into my jaw and my head snapped back, the blow ringing in my ears. I think he expected me to drop, or at least to stagger under the force of that blow. I disappointed my father for the last time. I moved in close and low and lay into him with a pair of punches to the liver. He made a strange sort of choking grunt that sounded almost like, "Oh?" as he staggered back against the house. He started to slide down against the wall to the ground, but I caught him, pressing against his throat with my left forearm as I stared into his face. I'm sure I showed all my teeth in some sort of snarl. I was absolutely feral. I saw it then, the fear in his eyes. He looked at me, and he was scared. I knew it, and it made me feel stronger. The shocking thing was that the fear wasn't something that suddenly appeared in his eyes. It had always been there. I just hadn't seen it for what it was until that moment. He wasn't powerful. He was a weak and cowardly wretch, and always had been. That was what made him cruel. He struggled to pry my arm away from his throat with both of his hands. He clawed at me and drew blood from my forearm. But I didn't notice until later. "You don't touch her!" I screamed in his face as I punched him. His head bounced against the house. "You don't hurt her!" I swung again. "You don't look at her!" I hit him again, punching into the gut the full force of the right arm that he had broken years earlier. "You don't punch!" He gurgled as his head bounced off the house and into the next punch with a series of wet thuds. "You punch!" I was barely aware of the crack in my hand. Something in it had broken as I punched him. I didn't care. I don't know how long I stood there, beating his head against the house. I know that by the time my mother was in the yard, shrieking at me, I had stopped forming words with my mouth and was just screaming into what had been my father's face as I hit it again and again with my broken hand. The past is not black and white to me. That red moment is seared into my memory and has never faded. The red in our mother's crazed eyes as she yelled at me to stop. The red of my sister's wet hair in the window as she stared at me in silent horror, but didn't lift a hand or say a word to object to what she watched me do. Especially the red of blood. Mine and my father's, it was all the same. It covered my broken fist and dropped onto and from the forearm that held him there. It bubbled and covered the pulpy mass of his face, where teeth and bone protruded in splinters that had cut into my skin. And it streaked the pale green of our house where the back of his skull had broken and painted the wall as he slid slowly toward the ground.